this second wave, we're going to see a lot of experimentation with not only with like, okay, where's the product market fit, but also with different game mechanics, like what is possible, what can we bridge over and put on chain. But also what I think is more interesting is instead of having this mindset of, okay, what traditional mechanics, traditional game loops can we bridge on chain? Instead taking like a first principles approach, analyzing, okay, what does it mean to be fully on chain and like constrained to the blockchain, and then develop mechanics from that are significantly different and unique compared to like traditional alternatives. And I think that's where it gets really exciting.
Welcome to the Deus Ex Style podcast.
Welcome to the Deus Ex Style podcast. I'm your host Kepler, and today I'm joined by Jacl to talk about on-chain games and autonomous worlds. And Jacl is the host of a Twitter space called Double Tap, where he interviews gaming professionals. And his latest series was about on-chain games, and now he brought like the key learnings with him today. Also writing like a report on on-chain games for Delphi. So welcome, Jacl. Maybe you can introduce yourself first to our audience.
Hello, sir. How are you?
Really good. Excited to have you on.
Yeah. It's nice to be back again. For anyone who's not familiar, so yes, I go by Jacl in Web3. I'm a research associate at Delphi Digital. I also co-host the Double Tap podcast alongside Alex Wetterman, who leads up the gaming initiative at Shima Capital. Apart from that, I like to spend time in the Wolves DAO as well as the Paladins DAO. And I spend a lot of time, probably too much time, on crypto Twitter.
Yeah, I guess we all do. I mean, it got better in the bear market, but it's still too much. So yeah, I guess like my first question would be around, you wrote a report or are currently writing a report for Delphi about on-chain games. You had this whole Twitter space series around it. Like, what made you do this? Like, what is most exciting to you? Like at the start, and maybe now that you did more research, like what are the most interesting points to you regarding like on-chain games, autonomous worlds, all of that stuff?
Yeah, I guess to preface everything, and the whole TLDR for this entire pod episode is going to be that I'm bearish short term, but cautiously optimistic / excited for the long-term future of fully on-chain games. What spurred me to kind of suggest to Alex that we would spend 4 to 5 weeks interviewing professionals within the on-chain gaming space, as well as the reason why I covered it for Delphi was just because in sort of recent months, it's had this resurgence in activity. Most people who know about fully on-chain games heard about it via like Dark Forest, which launched in 2021, if I remember correctly. And then it kind of died out. We had renewed interest when Loot launched, because that is technically a fully on-chain game. But it's more recently, I think, specifically because of the recent hackathon by ETH Global, OX Park, and Lattice, that the subsector, and I will refer to it as a subsector of blockchain gaming throughout this chat. Like the subsector has this sort of renaissance of like renewed interest, where a lot of new people, new builders are coming into the space, and a small handful of like really powerful tools have been released that I think are quite exciting, and have upped the level in terms of like what's possible with fully on-chain games, because it is a very restrictive climate to build a fun first game.
Yeah, and I kind of agree on like being very short term as well, because how I see it is more, it's like an interesting experiment, right? And I hope
Yeah,
that it will
exactly.
be successful, right? So of course you have like truly open economies. So for me, for example, that's like interesting to see what people come up with, because it's something like, if you compare to real world economies, you just have more control, I guess, over everything. So that's, for example, for me, like one of the things. But also, as you mentioned, like the tech isn't there quite yet, or at least you can only do simple on-chain games. So just seeing how that progresses, I think, yeah, that's just a lot to learn. And Dark Forest, that you mentioned as well, was already one of the projects that pushed ZK Tech as well, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that it's like a nice way where we have a use case that leads to more developments that are like can be applied more generally, and just like teach people about like the developments in blockchain basically. So yeah, I really like that take. So maybe for the start, because we mentioned all these different words, is we mentioned on-chain gaming, autonomous worlds, all of that. So could you maybe provide a definition? I'm not sure if it's possible to like a generalizable definition, but maybe your definition of these words and how they differentiate from each other.
Yeah. I wouldn't ever be so bold as to like pretend to have my own definition. I'm just like parroting what other people, smarter people in the space have kind of already laid out. And the idea is fairly fleshed out, I want to say, but it's still a completely new medium for games. And to go back briefly on like your point about how blockchain games have kind of uh, helped innovate on the underlying technology that is blockchain. It's tends to like, the thesis is that because gaming is a fairly low risk but high demand industry, that builders, developers are able to like really rapidly test new ideas, new tech, without needing to worry too much about like censorship or regulations and various other types of crackdowns. So what we tend to see historically is that like a new trend in gaming is, it tends to be the sort of a leading indicator on up and coming technologies, as well as a way to onboard more people. Um, so in terms of like actual definitions, so Gubsheep, also known as like Brian, who did a lot of work at OX Park and Dark Forest, has probably the most widely accepted definition. And there are sort of five defining principles of an on-chain game. That is that so number one would be the source of truth for game data is the blockchain, essentially meaning like all game data is stored on the blockchain. The game logic and all sort of in-game rules or physics are implemented via smart contracts. Um, the game is developed in accordance with ecosystem principles. My bad. Essentially meaning like everything's open source. Um, anyone is able to access the different interfaces or smart contracts or code logic, etc. Um, the game is client agnostic. I think this is a big one that most people think about when they think of on-chain gaming. Essentially meaning like if the creators, the original creators of the game, decided to shut it off or wanted to, that they're actually in fact like unable to do so, because of the open source nature of like all the smart contracts, all of the game logic, etc. The communicate, as long as the underlying blockchain is still functional, that game will remain. And then the final one being like the game embraces real world value of digital assets. And it's one of these like inherent pros and cons of on-chain gaming, in that like everything, your time, all the assets, all the effort that you would put into these games is financialized. And it just like it just is what it is. Like once you put everything on chain, then everything becomes financialized. So that would be on chain gaming. And I think So autonomous worlds is kind of a more recent buzzword that people like to use, and it's a different frame of mind or a different framework to explain the same thing. The main difference being that an autonomous world is larger than just a game. And it's kind of this idea that you can have an entire ecosystem, whether that be of like gamified experiences, social experiences, or whatever it is, that is again like completely open, permissionless, composable, transparent, immutable, or at least some parts of it will be immutable, and is persistent.
Yeah. Okay. That's already like the idea I got from it as well, without like diving deeper into the definitions myself. Like how I already saw it is basically autonomous worlds being like a subset of on-chain gaming, and as you say, like they're more of an ecosystem. So maybe like the governance, like you mentioned, rules and physics. So basically, in an on-chain game, how I would imagine it, like the developer sets these rules, and maybe in an autonomous world, these rules can be changed by governance, and then others can build on all these rules and maybe like standardized assets and stuff like that to build this ecosystem. Is that how you would see it?
Yeah, it's an interesting point actually, because there are some projects, and I think Loot is probably a good example of this, where they've taken like a completely blank slate or bottoms up approach, where there really isn't a thing to begin with, and it's more a a set of tools um, or like paintbrushes, for example, for the community to then um, enact their own ideas, to implement their own ideas, and sort of grow various different experiences within or on top of that blank slate. And I think the issue there is that there's no guidance. And at the end of the day, and we've seen this with platforms like Roblox took 10 years before there was enough quality experiences that people actually felt compelled to not only like be onboarded into the ecosystem, but to come back over and over and increase their playtime. And without it's the like Roblox is 100% the exception to the rule. Um, and I think Fortnite is a better comparable, where they started off with this core experience that the community could get behind and felt passionate about, and then implemented or had a framework where the community could then build on top of that IP, and you end up with the same sort of end result, where you have a ton of community driven, community built experiences. The only difference being is like how you engage in that end state. So Loot is an example of that blank slate approach, where it's almost like chaos, and no one can really get behind a single idea, so then nothing gets done. Whereas there aren't too many examples of live games right now that within the on-chain gaming sort of subsector. But if we imagine that Dark Forest had implemented more assets on chain, because Dark Forest wasn't a fully fledged game, it was it was, as you said, an experiment. But the idea being that there was that core experience set within a universe, like this space battleship strategy game, that attracted a certain type of user that was interested in that. And then those users went out to create their own interfaces, their own plugins, their own extensions, composably built on top of that core idea, because they were passionate about it, and because they wanted to, and it would help their experience or help improve their experience and the experiences of others. So I think that's two different approaches, but in my personal opinion, the more curated approach is definitely the preferred one.
Yeah, I agree with you here. Also, like Convoy Ventures had actually a great newsletter about that as well. They talked about like all these UGC platforms and how you can get there, and they also mentioned that Roblox is not really the historic example that teams should look at, but more something like Fortnite, where basically you start with the content and also establish an IP, right? And then, because it's kind of like if you only provide the tools, why would people come if like one thing is if your own content, you can basically show them the use case, and also you have like a distribution channel because the content also brings players. So yeah, completely agree with your take here.
And
It's
then also,
yeah.
Sorry, no, I was going to quickly, because I just remembered your original question about the physics or the rules, and just to answer that question. So based on that sort of mindset of taking a curated approach, you still also you can't be fearlessly permissionless, if that makes sense. So there needs to be at least a base layer of physics. And when people refer to physics in autonomous worlds or fully on-chain games, what they really mean is like the rules, like gravity, for example. If you want to have a real world comparable, you need that rule of gravity in order for other mechanics within the world to make sense or to operate correctly. So there is within all, or at least in my personal opinion, like as we move into the future and a lot more of these games are deployed, like there will be for almost all of them a core set of contracts that represent the physics of these worlds that are immutable and that can't be changed. However, to your point, like I know, for example, Citadel is going to start off with this approach, this curated single experience that has a set of fixed physics. However, once the game is live, they hand it off to the DAO, in which the core team has a stake in. And then if the DAO decides suddenly like, okay, maybe we don't like this being a space game and we want to bring it down onto like an earthly planet. And then they need to be able to change those core rules of physics to be applied to that new scenario.
Okay, yeah, got it. That's an interesting point, actually. That's basically permissionless within certain rules. But I think also because it is open source, I mean, someone could fork it and establish their own rules, right? And then players would be able to decide which world they find more intriguing, I guess.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, but I think like we can also draw parallels to DeFi, where we speak of progressive decentralization. I think this curated approach you're describing is kind of similar to that, where at the start you have the team that leads, and that doesn't mean like it has to be all top down, but it's more like you guide the community, and then you establish certain rules. These are not just like rules within the smart contracts, but also social rules like off chain, and that's how you grow the world basically. And yeah, I guess make it less susceptible to attacks in a way. Yeah, I think that's a really good framework. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also, like you said, the security issues. I was having a conversation the other day just about how if something is fearlessly permissionless and allows anyone to, create their own composable components, plugins, extensions, etc., then that sounds terrifying, especially in a crypto world where everything within the autonomous world is financialized. So there has to be some level of control, or at least a procedure for these these incoming smart contracts to be audited. At least those that have the potential to negatively impact like certain areas of the game, certain mechanics. If it's, like I said, completely fearlessly permissionless, then I think it's a disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, I think that will be like the most interesting part of, but it's also an interesting part of like how the economy reacts to that, right? So it's not just, I think, like on the tech side, but also you have, of course, like all the social consensus. Then you also have like how the economy reacts to it. So we will see a lot of interesting experiments over time. I just hope that not a lot of value gets lost. But yeah, we will see, I guess.
Yeah.
So coming like to the next point would be, Could you describe the picture of like the current landscape of on-chain gaming? For me, it still seems kind of small. So for example, like 1KX hosted an on-chain gaming summit, right? And there were like a little bit over 20 teams there, I think. And then the hackathon that you mentioned had like a little bit over 400 people, and they submitted like 109 projects. Like, yeah, just can you paint a picture of where basically the status quo is of the industry?
Yeah. So I guess if we want to first take a high level look at blockchain gaming as a whole, you kind of need to segregate it into different subsectors. So what many in like I quote unquote the mainstream sort of community or audience would refer to like games like Wildcard or Dead Drop, like putting aside labels, for example, like just for the minute, because that can be, a bit bullshit to be honest. But the idea of those games is that you have an entirely off-chain traditional game and you slap NFTs on top of it. The selling point being like this idea of ownership. If you take one step forwards and go slightly more on chain, a slightly more decentralized approach, then you have games like Illuvium or Ember Sword, where now not only do you have the NFT component, but you also most likely have a fungible token component, as well as you're leveraging or leaning more into open economies. And you may even have some limited on-chain mechanics. And then that final step, like what some people would call a true Web3 game or a fully on-chain game or an autonomous world, is something where all game logic and all the rules, all the data, as we, said at the beginning of the pod, is on chain. Now, when we look at, I guess one of the big reasons why people are getting so excited about on-chain games more recently is it all comes from, in my personal opinion, the launch of MUD. MUD. So MUD is essentially an on-chain gaming engine. You can loosely compare it to like Unity, but for fully on-chain games. And what's cool about MUD is, and it's not just MUD, because now since MUD has launched, there are now a ton of different. So MUD is focused or works together closely with Optimism and leverages the OP stack. We have Dojo, which is essentially the same thing but for Starknet. There are people building directly on Starknet. There was the recent announcement of the raise that I believe it was a 10 million raise by Argus Labs, and they're being built by one of the co-founders of Dark Forest. There are also a number of others. Curio is building some cool stuff. There's another game engine called Paima. Cometh is building some cool stuff as well. So essentially what I'm saying is this infrastructure layer is starting to really get developed, and the entry barriers for developers is drastically reducing. A quick example about that would be, for example, like, so Argus Labs and what was the other one? Argus Labs, and I believe it was Curio. Both have like an ESC system featured on chain and allow for code, a coding language called Go to be used. And essentially, in layman's terms, all that means is that like existing or experienced game developers who maybe don't know too much about like Solidity, for example, or Rust or Cairo, whatever it is, they are now able to use their pre-existing skills to continue developing some of these on-chain games. So it's, long story short, the new wave of on-chain gaming infrastructure has kind of more recently come to market, and now a lot of these sort of on the application layer, a lot of these teams are now leveraging those tools to create new experiences that weren't possible for before. So one of the big ones, and I should caveat this where it's like a lot of these projects are interconnected. So for those that don't know, OX Park is a non-profit foundation that supports a lot of these projects. Out of them came Lattice, and Lattice is essentially an engineering and product development studio. And then out of Lattice came Mud. So, and then, OX Park, Lattice, and Mud went together with ETH Global and had that hackathon. So they are kind of all, pumping each other's bags, but that's not here or there. The point I was trying to make is that using Mud in order to like showcase what the engine was capable of, Lattice created a game called OPCraft, which was essentially like a Minecraft clone, but fully on chain. So every block, it had like procedurally generated biomes and an infinite world, and every single block was represented on chain. Every single action was represented on chain, and they built it in like 2 months, which is like rewind back to Dark Forest days. And making an on-chain game was like building a game, like a proper game in Excel. Like, it was incredibly difficult. They had a ton of issues with like upgradability and expanding the world beyond their initial vision. Whereas now, like, those entry barriers, those challenges have been significantly reduced. However, it's still like, you're not going to see Call of Duty on chain. There are still a number of like really major limitations. Throughput, they still have issues with throughput, still have issues with speed, still have issues with costs. And those are like the big three that everyone talks about. What people don't really talk about is the fact that not all game genres suit on-chain games, or like the medium of on-chain games. You think about because of the inherent sort of traits of the blockchain itself, and therefore like the inherent traits of autonomous worlds, they tend to lend themselves to high stakes strategic gameplay. When everything is financialized, when every move has an associated cost to it, rational players are going to put a lot more time and effort into each and every decision in order to make the optimum decision. And that just like fundamentally lends itself more towards like strategic gameplay, and the financialization part of side of things lends itself more towards like high stakes gameplay. So I think what a lot of people need to realize, and part of the reason why I'm not as bullish as maybe some others, is that even when all of the technical challenges are abstracted and fade away, we're still left with a subsector of gaming that has a relatively small, I mean, right now it's unknown, but my theory is that it's going to be a fairly small total addressable market, like smaller than RTS games. And RTS is already a dying genre. So even if we come out at the end of this tunnel with like highly improved gameplay, like really engaging gameplay loops, and even new genres that are engaging and fun, I don't really think that it's going to be like a mass market product.
Okay, interesting. So let me recap a little bit and try to add my own flavor as well. So as I understood you, we're basically now in like the first steps where the infrastructure is good enough to build a little bit more than simple games, and especially build them faster. So we usually have this theory that basically you have these cycles of infrastructure getting developed, then people build apps on top, then apps reach a certain bottleneck, then we have developments in infrastructure, and so on, right? And if I understood you correctly, like we are now in the first stage where we can make the first apps, basically, yeah, like really usable games on chain. And then, of course, as you mentioned, we still have a lot of challenges And these will, like, once we reach, like, an on-chain game reaches enough daily active users, we will see, okay, we still have problems around throughput, for example, and then we will work on the infrastructure to get more scalable, and then we can allow for more use cases. But as I understood you, you're saying that, like, the end state of this isn't as big as some people may think. That, yeah, basically, I mean, you probably can't put, like, if a player does like 50 actions per second, you can't put it on chain probably, no matter the tech, right? But I think, like, one interesting part you also mentioned was the high stakes strategic gameplay, because it's basically something that, where a lot of the quote unquote gameplay or meta gameplay takes place in people's heads, and then the actions are
Mm.
very limited. It's like you have all these considerations you're doing, like what am I doing, what will the opponent do, like what are the possible moves, what are my resources, all of that. Then you just make one transaction based on that. And yeah, as you described, it's like probably the first use cases for on-chain games, because that's, yeah, it's less threatened by low throughput, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I would say we're in the second generation. So I would
Okay.
classify the first generation going back to like 2014, when we saw primitives like Hunter Coin, which I think, to my knowledge, is the first fully on-chain game. And then, we went through some cycles, and that ended up with like Loot and Dark Forest. And I would classify all of that as like this first wave. And the probably the true uh case of like a project spearheading that space would be Dark Forest. And it's no wonder then why people who are building out this current layer, infrastructure layer, like Mud and Argus Labs, for example, are the co-founders of Dark Forest. It's because during the time that they spent on building out Dark Forest, they had like so many learnings, and then they took those learnings to build out the infrastructure, just as you were pointing out. So now that improved infrastructure is in place, it's not perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than what was there before. Now we're going to see this second wave of applications come to market, and most of them are not, like, none of them know where product market fit is. Like, no, none of them. So everyone's experimenting. I think I would personally label this second wave more as experimentations rather than games. And through this second wave, we're going to see a lot of experimentation with, not only with like, okay, where's the product market fit, but also with different game mechanics, like what is possible, what can we bridge over and put on chain. But also, what I think is more interesting is, instead of having this mindset of, okay, what traditional mechanics, traditional game loops can we bridge on chain, instead taking like a first principles approach, analyzing, okay, what does it mean to be fully on chain and like constrained to the blockchain, and then develop mechanics from that are significantly different and unique compared to like traditional alternatives. And I think that's where it gets really exciting, like the nerd in me, because it's very possible, and I think quite likely, that the outcome over the next sort of, let's say, 3 years, maybe 3 to 5 years, is that we're going to get whole new genres, just like back in the day when we had RTS games like Warcraft birth a whole generation of like some of the biggest genres in the world, MOBA just being one of them. The downside of that was like, it was essentially the end of RTS games, although it took a while for them to kind of, fall down from the peak. But that's what gets me the most excited, to see what those new genres are going to be. And they're undoubtedly going to, in my personal opinion, going to be in line with that high stakes strategic gameplay. but I think they're going to be completely different. My only concern, and it's not really a concern, it's just sort of like a caveat to say that I don't think that's where gaming as an industry is heading. Like, I don't think we're slowing down. I don't think younger generations of gamers are looking for slower paced, highly sort of strategic, high stake gameplay. I think they're more in line with social experiences, and the high tick, like high throughput game genres are going to remain and likely going to get more popular. That said, they're hopefully, I think if we can as a cohort kind of support these games and really experiment, then there most certainly is going to be likely an older generation of gamer that can't keep up with like the online FPS, for example, or more competitive titles within that genre, where it's just a fact that younger people have a competitive advantage. And for example, as I've gotten older, I've tend to lean or I tend to go towards like RPGs or even RTS games. I've discovered a ton of like indie RTS games over the past couple of years, just because I can't really keep up with the whole live service hype cycle. Maybe I'm an outlier, but I think there's certainly a bunch of other people like me, and those within like the older generations that will find enjoyment and even some nostalgia within some of these new emerging on-chain genres.
Yeah, and maybe it also means that we need to find new KPIs, right? So probably we can't really look at something like daily active users, but when we
Yeah,
have like an open economy, it's more like GDP, right? Like you can have a smaller game with, let's say, 10,000 active players, but the economy behind it can be still big and enough for a game developer to, yeah,
100%.
to be
It's a it's
profitable.
a it's a great point. Like, I was going to bring it up actually, and it's something that I wrote out in the report, that
Hmm.
especially because these fully on-chain games are getting connected to the global liquidity layer, that it's completely different stakes. Like, no longer do you need 100,000 daily active users spending between $5 and $15. Like, now you can have a handful, like even 10 players that are spending millions within your game. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but this is crypto, right? There's stupid money here. And 100%, if people get engaged in some of these games, especially if the mechanics are more tailored towards like certain DeFi mechanics or financialized loops, then like 100%, I think there's going to be a small cohort of people who are native to Web3 that are going to love them, and they're going to spend a ton of money.
Yeah, also as you say, like when these games, and I agree here with you that they target like an older audience, these are the people that have more disposable income.
Correct.
And then if you have like this, basically you have DeFi attached to games automatically. So you just vastly increase the spending depth also, like when
Yeah.
you compare to mobile games. And when you look at the games that have been most successful, it's usually like you went from just selling like a premium game to people with like a capped spending, right? Like $60, for example, to mobile games which have like non-capped, like uncapped spending depth, most of it, or like not uncapped, but much deeper spending depth. And then I feel like for on-chain games, this will be 100x spending depth of like compared to mobile games. So yeah, that will be interesting to see. And I guess like from your thoughts looking forward, how would you say, where does value accrue, and maybe where would you like put your bets? So my first thought was when you talked about experimentation, it's usually when you're still in this like exploration phase where you need to find product market fit. Usually the teams that win are the ones that are native to the industry, and like they
Yeah.
skew usually younger, right? And when you figured out this blueprint, you usually have the exploitation phase basically, and then you support the teams that are like more experienced and basically know how to run a business. So yeah, maybe you can give some color on that.
Yeah, I think I hate to say it, like I really hate to say it, but we are potentially a little bit too early to really place our bets. Um, Simply because there's like, even if you look at the market right now, there's like there's, I would say, less than 10, potentially less than 5 games that you can actually play. That said, the development of these games, because they're more simplistic in nature, is faster than your typical like AAA title. So we are going to see the space move incredibly fast over the next like 12 to 24 months. So with that said, I think I break it down in like my mental model is essentially there's 3 layers to it. There's the asset layer, the participation layer, and the structural layer. When we look at the asset layer, you're essentially looking at Loot as the perfect case study. So Loot, if you're not familiar, when they launched, it was almost a stealth launch. You had to mint directly from the contract. There was 8,000 NFTs in total, and within like a week, they generated something stupid like more than 100,000 in trading volume, like 100,000 ETH in trading volume. Oh no, sorry, more than 30k ETH in trading volume within the first 5 days, and the floor price jumped like I want to say 13,000% within the first week. And now, okay, they had really great timing. I believe they launched like Q4 2021. But, it's a good case study as to what could happen in the future. So if you pay attention to the narrative and see where attention is accruing. So right now it's obviously with OX Park, Lattice, and Mud, in my personal opinion, like anecdotally. I was joking with someone the other day who said probably one of the best ways to spread your bets and get promising upside would be if there was like a Mud index, and you could just invest across the current sort of Mud ecosystem. But being the asset layer, like that's an investment within the NFTs. Now, the second one I'll talk about is the structural layer, and that's looking at like, okay, well, if blockchain gaming as a subsector kind of blows up and gets more attention and kind of increases the activations, then you're looking at where will like essentially what network tokens are going to appreciate because of that. So the 2 big networks, blockchains that currently have fungible tokens, or I shouldn't say currently, but one of them is obviously Optimism, due to their close association with Starknet. Sorry, with Mud. And this is, it's pushing it a little bit, but there is an indirect correlation between like how well the Mud ecosystem does and how well or how many projects start utilizing the OP stack, and then that's going to indirectly sort of benefit Optimism and the OP token. So that's one. The other is obviously Starknet. I think that's probably the second biggest like L2. We know that Stark token is coming. We don't know much more than that, but I would speculate that similar to the OP token, Optimism token, like it's the same thesis for Stark. I think in addition to that, you also have like what some have called proof of game work tokens. A good example of this would be like Magic within the Treasure ecosystem or Lords within the Realms ecosystem. What that essentially is so a token that someone can win or earn within one game and spend within another. So just how the Treasure ecosystem works, you can earn or be rewarded Magic tokens in one game or in one area of the ecosystem, and then you can spend that elsewhere. And because of Magic or Treasure's association with like on-chain gaming, as on-chain gaming gets more attention and grows, then you could see some of that demand trickle down into the Magic token, and then thus it would have some value accrual. All of this is highly speculative. Like, I'm definitely not trying to put a flag in the ground here. I think this is just using some loose connections to speculate as to like where value will accrue. I think the most interesting one, at least to me, is this participation layer. And that's essentially like guilds, DAOs, or individuals that actually decide to put in work and industrialize certain activities within these on-chain games, within these autonomous worlds. I can easily see just how we were previously talking about, like, essentially you don't need such a broad net to capture like in-app spend, and instead you can have deep liquidity. Under that same kind of thought process, I think it's quite, and especially when you compare it to some of the like larger scale MMOs in a traditional climate, like EVE Online, for example, like 100%, I think it's quite almost a given for some of these on-chain MMOs in particular that we're going to see like true DAOs that are industrializing certain aspects of the game, whether that be supply chains, asset production, labor, whatever it is. We'll see specialization. Those who are capital rich or have certain skills that maybe other individuals are lacking will be able to benefit from this by essentially specializing and benefiting from economies of scale to then, like I said, industrialize their activities to make a profit on it. And I think it's interesting to think about how like the role of sub DAOs within an on-chain economy. And we've already seen it emerge within DeFi, but like within a gaming context it's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I think like the last point you made about guilds and DAOs is not something I considered yet, I guess. Do you see, like, because we kind of had like this hype cycle around guilds already in like 2021, do you see like any guilds right now that specialize on like on-chain games?
There are some emerging.
Okay.
And to be clear, like when I say guilds, I'm not referring to this idea of like play to earn, breeding, scholarships. Like it's a completely different business model. Like I think guilds, I shouldn't have said guilds. We should refer to them as DAOs or sub DAOs, because that's what they are effectively. Or like certain highly capitalized individuals that then, maybe outsource some of the work or decide to, market makers provide liquidity, that kind of thing. And maybe that's their avenue. But it's like this idea of like people outside of the core development team are engaging with these worlds at such a high level that they're actually able to profit and treat them almost like a job. And obviously the rewards will depend on like how much liquidity is in that given autonomous world.
Would you also include there like DAOs that are basically like a second developer to a team? So for example, on like Fortnite nowadays, also on Roblox, we had like game studios that build specifically games on these platforms, right? And some of them make a good amount of money and most don't make any money at all, really. Would you say that that's also like a possible business model, I guess, for DAOs
100%.
to provide? Yeah, right.
100%.
Because I feel like on-chain games is like mods and UGC on steroids. So I feel like the market opportunity
it's like
there is
Overwolf.
quite big.
I don't know if you're familiar with the platform Overwolf, but it's essentially what you're talking about, right? Like, and that's what I meant by industrializing certain activities. It doesn't have to
Hmm.
be gameplay related. It can be the creation of plugins, or certain add-ons or extensions or whatever it is. Like, if you're playing a highly financialized game and you're taking it seriously as a player, you're gonna want whatever can provide you with the highest competitive advantage. And like we said, a lot of that metagame happens within your head, and not everyone is like a crazy mathematician or whatever it is, and some people can even derive increased value from some of these like analytical tools, for example. So like 100%, that's you know Overwolf as a platform is completely a Web 2 platform, but I believe they just acquired a studio for a fairly large amount of money. I can't remember on the details, but essentially what I'm getting at is like this is a proven business model that works. There is demand for it within a Web 2 context. But like you said earlier, I think you just need to change the KPIs a little bit. And instead of being, okay, we need to target games that have a really large player base. Instead, it will be, okay, let's target the games with the highest liquidity, or the most like the most concentrated sort of handful of whales, or whatever it is. Those KPIs are yet to be defined.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point you mentioned here is with like changing KPIs, what we also may see is just like changing business models.
Yeah.
So for like the on-chain games, for example, you probably won't be able to sell like in-app purchases, but you have to make your money another way, right? For example, by taxing activity within the broader ecosystem, I guess. So yeah, we have like a lot of layers where we will see experimentation and innovation. It's like the tech layer, then just the gameplay layer, business model layer, basically everything will get touched.
Yeah.
And we will then see like what mix of all those layers works best. Yeah, I mean, I can't really do like a bold prediction of it, to be honest. Do you have like any piece we can put on Twitter, like any bold prediction or something?
I think I don't have a bold prediction. Like I've speculated enough in this podcast, but I will say something that I also found interesting. Like I spent a lot of time thinking about was the parallels between. So I'm a personal believer in the transition from the gas model, like games as a service, into like the gap model, games as a platform. Um, and without going into too much detail, games as a platform essentially describing what like the UEFN, like Fortnite creative mode is, or what Roblox is. And I think that's a fundament is going to be a sort of new paradigm in gaming, or at least in the business models that some of these larger corporates are going to be implementing. And then I started to wonder at like, okay, well, what are the parallels between fully on-chain games and these games as a platform? And when you think about it, there are actually my personal thoughts on like what is the benefit, the core benefit, the biggest benefit that is exclusive to autonomous worlds is composability. And when you think about composability, it goes back to what we were just talking about, like permissionlessly, or to a certain extent, permissioned, the ability to create UGC essentially. So now, okay, if we have an autonomous world put up against Fortnite, like what are the differences? What are the similarities? When it comes to the UGC element, I would argue that autonomous worlds are easier in the sense that a lot of it is permissionless, and the monetization model is also like it's just baked in. The downsides, or where they're not, it doesn't meet the bar set by Fortnite, is it doesn't have that existing monetization to kind of tap into, and the tools are still not as easy. Like Unreal Engine is probably one of, if not the most widely used game engine, which means that like a huge number of existing developers already have access to it or are able to leverage those tools. On-chain gaming, okay, not everyone knows Solidity, but even then you look at Starknet and it's like even fewer people know what the hell Cairo is. So that's definitely a barrier to entry and something holding them back. But let's hypothesize for a second that maybe they're on equal footing in terms of the tech. Maybe there aren't any tech limitations or restrictions that that hold autonomous worlds back from competing on par with Fortnite. Obviously, we're generalizing here a little bit because the genres are different. And like I said before, the total addressable market for on-chain games is likely going to be much or drastically smaller than for Fortnite. But I do think that there's a compelling argument to be had that autonomous worlds present a fairer, more transparent, and I think the kicker here is permanent solution to this games as a platform model. We've seen issues before with X Labs and how Activision shut X Labs down. X Labs was like holding a I believe it was Modern Warfare 2 server, custom server, and Activision went after them with a cease and desist and essentially shut it down. And this was a community driven project that had a small but very loyal player base, and they just got like decimated by Activision. And I think if we see more of these types of incidents occur, we're going to have an ever increasingly large percentage of gamers who start to demand for a certain level of maybe not permanence, but at least accountability, like holding these developers accountable for their future enjoyment. And autonomous worlds provide this sort of, inherent permanence that is undeniable. And I think it's going to appeal to maybe not a very large percentage of gamers, but there definitely is something there.
Yeah, I also think like for the businesses just building in the ecosystem, when you have like this more neutral layer, I guess, and more equal relationship, it reduces your business risk. Because right now, if I'm building on Roblox, and they just ban my game, then I lose everything. Basically, my business is dead. But if I build in like an ecosystem of an autonomous world, there's not really a way for me to get banned in the same way, right? So yeah, it might not like start with the users demanding it first, but maybe just the builders moving to a different platform first. Just as an idea. So I guess like we went through a lot of the advantages of on-chain gaming. Anything else you would like to add there? Because then I would like to move on to like the challenges that still exist, to touch on them briefly as well.
Yeah, I mean the challenges are, I think, fairly obvious for anyone who spent any time within Web3. Like, it doesn't have to be in on-chain gaming. Like, there are still issues of like onboarding friction. Like, to play Dark Forest, I think there was a stupid number of different steps you had to take before even like getting into the game. And then once in the game, you have to like, if you can't write smart contracts, then you're at an incredible disadvantage. If you can't create plugins, then you might as well give up on getting anywhere near the top of the leaderboard. So there's definitely that. Then, typical issues surrounding like throughput, cost, speed, those still exist, right? And although there's a lot of interesting things happening with ZK proofs, account abstraction, session keys, a lot of cool stuff with new token standards, bundling, NFT bundling, client-side proofs. Like, all of these things are being developed in real time. Rollups, sharding, sidechain solutions, like all of this is improving these challenges. but it's not like fully abstracting them. Like it's not fully absolving them. I think it's still going to be years before, we get anything close to a traditional gaming experience. But that said, as we've touched on many times already, it doesn't necessarily have to be a one-to-one comparable with like Call of Duty. It could just be Age of Empires on chain, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like I fucking love Age of Empires. And then in those cases, like as you adapt to the constraints and design these new innovative mechanics around them, then I think those technological challenges become less of a roadblock.
Yeah, and I think like everything you mentioned is something that people can see. I think there's also like some of the back end processes that maybe less like if I'm a user, I can see that gas costs are high, but maybe what I'm not seeing is how did the developers make it that they hide certain information to like the enemy player, right? That's where like ZK tech comes in, for example, or
Yeah.
in games you usually need randomness, but having randomness on chain is actually not that easy to have like verifiable
It is really
randomness, right?
difficult.
So yeah, I think there's also, yeah, I agree. There's still a lot of friction, but also that could be opportunity where like value can accrue, right? So when we talk about like the different layers, I guess that there are to a game, maybe it's like an infrastructure project that wants to work on that, or maybe it's something that a DAO can provide a certain service. So yeah, that's like the experimental phase. I think we talked about this a lot. So I guess like one part I wanted to touch on lastly was, do you see botting as more of a challenge, or is it more something for on-chain games where it's an opportunity as well as like you make a
It's a
game that
feature.
has it's a feature, right? Yeah. Okay.
It's a feature. Like you can't avoid it. Like there is no getting around it. Like in most of these games, like Dark Forest, for example, the top players built their own bots. It was like expected of you to create your own bots. You weren't manually inputting instructions. You created plugins or bots to do the dirty work for you. And I think it's going to remain like that. I was reading something that essentially was just talking about how trivial gameplay mechanics don't work in on-chain gaming. Like you can't have a casual game be an on-chain game, because it's going to get botted to high hell and it won't be enjoyable for anybody. Like you need to, like at the game design level, you need to make sure that every action, every player action, every mechanic has meaning and non-trivial meaning. Like they need to be complex. Like the more complex a mechanic is, the less it can be botted, or less susceptible it is to botting. And then it just becomes a design decision as to like, okay, do you want bots to be a feature or not? And then it, that will help shape the game design.
Yeah, I think I read that as well. I think it was Mithrium or that put it out, the
I
blog
think you're right.
post.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree. And it's also something we touched on before is like what types of gameplay you can have on chain. And you mentioned this highly complex strategic gameplay. And that's also, yeah, because bots probably can't reason the same way that people can, at least for now.
Yeah.
So they're like botting is less of an issue. But I think it's also related to like all the play to earn we went through, where basically you rewarded trivial gameplay, and that was also botted, right? So we actually have examples within blockchain gaming, of course another vertical, but where it didn't work this way, and where that's not really a game design decision, more like a game economy decision where you would reward other actions, for example. But yeah, we kind of had a similar situation before, so that's also why I'm hopeful that people will solve it, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, I think on-chain games are kind of uniquely positioned to take advantage of bots within a gameplay. So like I personally don't think that the gaming industry is ever going to eradicate bots. Like, it will always be a cat and mouse situation. Um, and I think what's cool then, if you change your perspective and let's say, for example, okay, well, maybe instead of trying to dissuade users from creating bots, you encourage that activity, you encourage that behavior. Like,
Yeah,
what if
yeah.
there was a game where like you control an army of bots and like that is the core gameplay loop? I don't think, there's anything necessarily wrong with that, provided that, you keep users safe and they're engaged by the gameplay loops. Then like, I think lean into it as heavy as possible, because it's gonna only ultimately it's only going to differentiate on-chain games from other genres, which is going to help carve out its own unique niche within the industry.
Yeah, and it's also where like blockchain has an actual use case, because it's like the best infrastructure for bots to do payments, right?
Yeah.
So you could say it's like the natural progression. Also, if you say, okay, a bot plays the game, but maybe it automatically pays like a DAO to take on a certain service. So you can like add to it as well, where it becomes like the bot is the player and we all as humans just serve the bot towards like finishing the game, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it. We talked for more than an hour. So I give you like a short chill zone, chill your podcast, your work, anything you want. Where can people follow you?
Lovely. I've really enjoyed the conversation, by the way. It's always a pleasure. Can't wait for the next one. But in terms of like, people can find me on Twitter. I guess that's where I share the most of my thoughts. I'm there at Jacl, JACL_E9. We do the Double Tap weekly podcast every Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. EST. We're on a hiatus for the next 2 weeks, but when we come back, we're going to come back stronger, better than ever. There may even be a moment where I decide to dox myself, even though I'm doxed, like I'm making it sound like a big deal. And then obviously, I definitely have to give props to Delphi, seeing as essentially all of the content from this podcast has come from the report that I wrote over there, or at least the highlights of it. And any listener that does have a subscription or doesn't yet have a subscription to Delphi Digital, I would highly recommend it. Like, the amount of gigabrain sort of knowledge share that happens over there in the portal is next level, and it's definitely leveled up my research capabilities tenfold.
Yeah, I agree. I also had a Delphi subscription, so yeah. So yeah, I guess I'll see you in the next one. We should definitely have another podcast sometime. And until I see you.
See ya, mate.
Thanks for tuning in to the Deus Ex DAO podcast, a place where some of the most progressive and innovative builders, thought leaders, and traders in the crypto space come together to discuss all areas of the crypto industry. Whether you're into DeFi, Layer 1s, Layer 2s, NFTs, or anything in between, we've got you covered. And as a reminder, nothing said on this podcast should be construed as financial advice or as a solicitation to buy or sell any digital asset or security. The comments, views, and opinions expressed by the hosts or guests on the podcast are their own. As always, you'll need to do your own research.